we're all getting to be pretty good at this Zoom thing. I've been taking my classes, my college classes, for quite some time using Zoom, so I'm familiar with it, and we're utilizing this opportunity to continue our teaching for the youth group on Joseph. Now, if you remember last time we talked about Joseph rising to a very high level of power or authority in the nation of Egypt. Now, there was a lot of things had to happen before he was able to get there, but nevertheless, he was brought before the Pharaoh who was having these dreams. Now remember, Pharaoh was not a Christian, but he was having these dreams, and no magician or sorcerer or wise man that the Pharaoh had could answer them. And if you remember the story about the baker and the cupbearer said, "Ooh, I remember a guy, he can interpret dreams." And so they went back to the prison, and they found Joseph and cleaned him up and brought him before the Pharaoh. And there he interpreted this dream about fat, sleek cows and skinny, ugly cows. And the ugly cows ate the fat, sleek cows. Well, it turns out, and there was another dream also about ears of corn, and how there were 7 plump ears and there were 7 scrawny ears and so forth. The story or the dream was the same. And what it was telling the people is that God was going to send a plague upon the earth, but he was giving everyone 7 years to prepare. And so Joseph, being a godly man, was able to interpret the dream. He could tell the Pharaoh what it meant. And that's when the Pharaoh said, "Who would be better for this job than you?" I'd like to pick up on that in chapter 41. And I'd like to begin reading in chapter 41, verse 41. And it says, "So Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt.' And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. And he dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a golden chain around his neck. And he had him ride in his chariot," which was the Pharaoh's chariot, "and as the second in command. And when he did, people shouted before him, 'Make way, make way!' Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Now, before we go on, let me explain a couple things to you, because we do things a little bit different here today than we did then. It mentions the signet ring. Well, the signet ring was very important to the kings of old, because they would have a ring that they would wear on their hand, and that ring had a symbol on it. And that symbol, whenever they wanted to sign a letter or some important document, they'd put a little bit of wax on it, and you probably saw this in movies, and they would use that ring to push it into the wax. There was only one ring that had those markings on it, and that would be the signet ring of the king. And so the king took it off and put it on the finger of Joseph. So what exactly was the king telling Joseph? There's no one in the kingdom that is higher, that has more authority, that has more power than you. You're wearing the ring. But of course, there would be one, and that would be the owner of the ring, which would be the Pharaoh. And so the Pharaoh put him in a very high position, and instead of sending out letters and saying, "Hey, I've just appointed this young guy who's only 30 years old, I've appointed him to be the number 2 guy in all of Egypt," they sent out chariots, and he was riding in the Pharaoh's chariot. And before him, people were shouting that this is Joseph, and he is now the number 2 man, but everyone will answer to him. Let me read on a little bit more, because there's some more very interesting parts of this story. "So then the Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I am Pharaoh, but without your word,'" meaning I'm the top guy, but you're so important that without your word, nothing can be done in all of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name. He gave him an Egyptian name. And the Egyptian name is a little bit of a tongue twister. So let me say it for you. It's Zaph Nath Pani. Zaph Nath Pani. Zaph Nath Pani. And to give him more of, to give him a higher standard, he said, I'm also going to give you a wife. And the wife that he gave to him, her name was Asenath. And she was the daughter of a priest whose name was Potipherah. Notice the similarity in the names, Potiphar, Potipherah. And he gave her to him. One more notation I'll make about that is that the daughter, the woman that he gave to Joseph, was the daughter of a priest, but not a Jewish priest and not a godly priest. It was a priest of their particular religion. So then it goes on to tell us that Joseph was 30 years old. And at 30 years old, he became not just the number 2 man in Egypt, but he became essentially the most powerful man in the entire world. There was no nation that was as powerful as Egypt. There was no nation that had as great a navy, as great an army, as renowned for their building endeavors. There was no one that was more adept than or important than Joseph. Why is that interesting? Well, because at 30 years old, he basically became the ruler of the world, and he was a godly man. It was God's will, God's choice, God's plan, God's design that Joseph would be brought to Egypt for this very reason. Now, the next few verses tell us about what exactly happened, and this is all we're going to cover for this lesson. All right? But listen carefully to how it is all described, and reading to you from the Bible. These stories that we're talking about right now are 3,500 years old. So even though we can understand them and we can relate to them and we can even marvel at young Joseph and how the Lord blessed him, these stories can also be for us today and can help us. And so it says that Joseph went out from the Pharaoh's presence and he traveled throughout Egypt. And while he was traveling throughout Egypt, Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt, and he stored them in cities. And each city he put food that was grown from the field surrounding it. It says that Joseph stored such huge quantities of grain that it became like the sand of the desert. Sand of the desert. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to the desert, but when you go to the desert, as far as you can see, all you see is sand. And when you pick up sand from the desert, it's like a dust. It's very, very fine. And what the Bible tells us is that the amount of food that they were gathering up was so great and so vast that it was like trying to count the sand, that the individual grains of sand on the desert. I'm pretty much sure you don't think that's possible, but it isn't possible. And so Joseph, it said that he quit trying to count because there was so much grain. And so they stopped recording it. They just said this particular city has some certain amount of storage areas and they're full to the max with food. That is important because later that abundance of food would be necessary to feed the people of the planet, because what happens here, I believe, saved all of mankind. There was some type of a catastrophic event that took place at this time. We don't know what it was. Maybe it was a meteor that passed too close to the earth. Maybe it was some kind of a solar event where the sun acted a certain way. We don't know what happened, but we do know that for 7 years there wasn't a winter or a summer or a fall or a spring. All there was heat. All there was dry wind that blew, and there was no way to get any food, and there you couldn't grow any food. And so God used Joseph to store enough food to feed the whole known world for 7 full years. Now there's one more thing we're going to touch on, and that'll be all for today. While Joseph was a young man and God blessed him and the Pharaoh gave him a wife, he had 2 sons. And his sons, their names were, and it's recorded, their names were Manasseh. And Manasseh means, it is because God made me forget all my trouble. That's his name. So when the little boy was born, instead of Joseph naming him Paul or John or Rick or Tom, he said, this little boy has made me forget all of my hardships, all of my troubles, all the pain that he had gone through. And Joseph went through a lot of pain in his life to get to this point. And then it says a little bit later, God blessed him with another, and his name was Ephraim. And Ephraim, it says his name is, it is because God made me fruitful in this land of my suffering. So, as I said, instead of, and maybe someday you'll meet someone who's named like that, where you walk up and say, what's your name? And says, my name is, I made my daddy forget how tough his life was. Or my name is, I have remembered God's blessing to me. Those are names in the Hebrew language. So God blessed Joseph. God did some wonderful things in his life, and these stories really happened. And even though it was so very, very long ago, these stories happened. God protected Joseph. God used Joseph and brought him to a place where he would be in charge of, or instrumental in saving almost the whole world. Now, in your life and in many people's lives, they say, God, I want you to bless me. Bless me now, right now. What are you waiting so long for? Bless me now. But you see, that's not how things work sometimes. Sometimes it takes a very, very long time for God to bring about his plan. So what we have to do is learn from the lesson of Joseph, who ended up being at the bottom of a cistern. And from there, in about 14 or 15 years, he ended up being in the throne next to Pharaoh. He endured, he was patient, and he was faithful through that time. So God bless you. And I hope that you enjoyed this lesson. And I look forward to telling you more at a later time. God bless you. Thank you.